I find legacy conversations to be extremely interesting because I honestly believe that God would have it such that after we've left the earth, the lives we live here will continue to impact generations. Let me ask you a question. Do you work with your spouse or do you work for your spouse? What has that got to do with legacy? I'll come back to that. My name is Joe-Ezigbo. I'm a transformational business leader and the double impact coach. I help entrepreneurial couples to build sustainable businesses God's way. A few years ago, I found myself in a conversation with one of my mentees on the community. He had made an offhanded remark, and so I asked him whether his wife was a shareholder in his business. He simply laughed and said, well, she's my wife, so when I die, everything that I have, she's going to get it anyway. And then I asked him if he had made a will. Of course, the answer was no. So I asked him, so what exactly are you leaving to your wife? I promise you he gave me one of those it's not my portion looks. But you and I know that there have been countless of stories of people who have died interstate without leaving a will, that is, and then thrown their dependents into financial ruin and difficulty for years. If you work with your spouse, there are two different scenarios. You could be working with your spouse as an equity partner in the business, which is the better scenario. Or you could hire your spouse to work with you. And when that happens, if anything were to happen to you, immediately you find that your spouse has no say in the financial decisions or the operational decisions about the business you were running together. You can also have a situation, like I've said earlier, where your spouse totally is cut off financially. One of the fundamental tenets of working successfully with your spouse is that you both recognize each other as individuals with the full sets of rights, with the full sets of entitlements and capabilities where the business is concerned. So I repeat that if your spouse does not have an equity stake in the business that you run together, then actually your spouse is working for you and not working with you. And this is an unsafe position and it's an unfair position. You want to position your spouse to be sure that if anything happened to you, they would have a legal say in the affairs of the business that you've been running together over the years. This is where the comments I made at the beginning about legacy and the question I asked about whether you're working for or with your spouse then come to a head in the estate planning conversation, whereby you want to be sure that you have taken a position whereby should something happen to one person, the other person has continuity of ownership and operations. And you want to think about how this impacts on your children as well. If you're a couple who have already found yourselves in this situation where only one person has an equity stake in the business, it's not too late to deal with it. Sit down and have the conversation, do the allotment of shares, and file it properly. Make sure you get the legal documentation from the Corporate Affairs Commission. Remember, it's about legacy. We know companies that have lasted for generations because of that kind of continuity. We also know companies that have died simply because the founder died. In this case, you have the privilege of a co-founder who is also your spouse and trusted partner. So take the best advantage of that in the interest of a legacy outlook for your business and for your life. I hope these tips have been useful to you today. And if you have any questions around estate planning, around legacy, and addressing equity issues when you work with your spouse, please drop your comments and your questions, and I'll be happy to get back to you. Take care.